Hans Blix reported that his teams have found no weapons of mass destruction and see signs Iraq is starting to cooperate. In a further slap at Powell, Blix contradicted U.S. intelligence that Iraq has hidden weapons from the inspectors.
In no case have we seen convincing evidence that the Iraqi side knew in advance that the inspectors were coming.
That, believe it or not, happened 10 years ago this week. 10 years since the UN weapons inspector Hans Blix told the UN his team's search for WMD in Iraq, they weren't coming up with anything. They didn't have much anything. He said it right there. You heard it. It was 10 years ago this week. A massive global anti-war protest was being held with millions of people taken to the streets from New York to Sydney. None of it ultimately mattered. Our government was determined to go to war. The Bush administration was basically propping up anyone with any kind of credibility on the matters of national security to go out and make the case. We now know there was no case to go to war with Iraq. But we are hearing from key players now. The landscape is really changing on this story. For the first time, we're hearing people come forward about how the Bush administration forged ahead with their plan and how they got away with it. It's all part of a new MSNBC documentary airing this Monday night, 9 o'clock Eastern Time, narrated by our own Rachel Maddow, called Hubris, Selling the Iraq War. It's based on a book by the same name, Michael Isikoff and David Corn. In this excerpt, Vice President Dick Cheney makes his case in a speech to veterans of foreign wars. CENTCOM Commander Anthony Zinni was there, said he couldn't believe what he was hearing.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
I had a seat at the stage next to the lectern where he was speaking, and I literally bolted at that.
With our help, a liberated Iraq can be a great nation once again.
Vice President Dick Cheney's speech to the veterans of foreign wars is the opening salvo of the Bush administration's effort to sell to the American people what White House insiders call the product.
Thank you very much.
It was a shock. It was a total shock. I couldn't believe the vice president was saying this. In doing work with the CIA on Iraq WMD, through all the briefings I heard at Langley, I never saw one piece of credible evidence that there was an ongoing program. And that's when I began to believe they're getting serious about this. They want to go into Iraq.
Joining me now, Rachel Maddow, narrator of the documentary Hubris, Selling the Iraq War, which premieres Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern on this network, and David Corn of Mother Jones Magazine, who co-authored the book. Great to have both of you with us. Thanks, Rachel, the people coming forward, going on record, will change a lot of people who were thinking, well, we really did the right thing.
Two things have been happening in the 10 years since we were led into this war from the political right. And one is the idea that it wasn't that much of a mistake. You see that still happening in politics this past week in Capitol Hill, right? People defending the Iraq war as if it were the right thing to do. But also this idea that we were all in bed together, that we all made the same wrong decision together as a nation, that there was no dissent, and that we all believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. I'm so glad you played that footage of what was going on 10 years ago today with those global worldwide protests about going into Iraq. We didn't convince the war. They didn't convince enough people in the United States to call it a nation going to war. But because it was our government leading the deception campaign, we went. And I don't think we've appreciated how big a deal that was for us as a country, how big a deal that was for the world. We've been so close to it for so long. It's 10 years. It's time to step back and realize what that was.
Will it change how we view confrontations in the future?
I think it already is changing that. You know, I mean, you see people right now, even within the Obama administration, leaking stuff to the press, trying to make it seem like there's stuff going on with WMDs in Syria, which means we have to go to war in Syria. And the response is, you know what? That intelligence has not been confirmed. We are not going to run with it. There's going to be some pushback on that. I do think there is a higher bar. I do think that we elected Barack Obama in part because he was on the right side of the Iraq war debate. But the revisionist history on why we went to Iraq and who got us there is an active campaign right now.
David Corn, what have we learned?
Well, I think Rachel's right. The bar has been raised because we learned that the government pulled what Larry Wilkinson in the film, he was chief of staff to Colin Powell at the time, he calls it a hoax. That's a pretty big word to use. That the campaign to convince this nation to go to war, a war that led to the loss of almost 5,000 American lives and over probably 100,000 civilian Iraqi lives, was a hoax. So I think we've learned to sort of, be careful when people tell us that there's a threat at hand. But at the same time, to be a little less optimistic about it, a lot of the people who got us into the war, a lot of those neocon drum majorettes and cheerleaders, Dick Cheney and others, when they come out today and say something, they're still accorded a fair degree of respect. They haven't been laughed out of town or tar and feathered and chased away because of what they've done. There hasn't been a full accounting or full consequences applied. And so that means, as Rachel points out in the film itself, that this could happen again under another set of circumstances in the not-too-distant future.
Well, let me tell you, when I was in high school, the Vietnam War was raging, and when the war ended, we all thought, well, gosh, as a country, we'll never do that again. Guess what? Yeah. I mean, that's why this documentary is so critically important for the generation following us to consume this and to understand how we were lied into this. What about that, Rachel?
I think, Ed, one of the things that ends up being important is the way that we describe to one another, even if it's not formal history, just our oral history about how we describe that as a country. And I think that when you get down to the case that was made about why we had to go, it turns out that it was, as David puts it, a hoax. The case about why we had to go turned out not to be true. It was maintained to us as if it were true. And that has to be seen as an original sin for why that war ended up being a bad idea. We all respect the people who served. We all thank and frankly love the troops who went there because their country asked them to. But the grounds on which they were asked to go were false. And that has to be the way that we tell this story forever, so we don't do it again.
And David, the media role in this, there was a lot of promotion, a lot of flag waving, and not critical questions, or is that an overstatement?
No, not at all, Ed. I mean, at the time, I was raising questions about the intelligence, 10 years ago to today, and it was a very lonely position. Even, liberal columnists were out there going along with this. And the New York Times, with reporting by Judy Miller, was basically reinforcing the propaganda from the administration and became sort of an echo chamber between the administration and a lot of voices in the media, many of whom have still not apologized and still have their very well-compensated perches in our media political culture. So this stuff can't happen. Or let me put it another way, Ed. It's much more difficult to pull off a hoax like this if you have skeptical or just good reporters out there putting this stuff to hard questions. Right. And that didn't happen at the time, and that made it a lot easier for Dick Cheney and George W. Bush to make statements like we just heard Dick Cheney say that had nothing to do with the truth.
All right. Rachel, looking forward to your show at 9 o'clock tonight. After this one, David Corn, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it so much. Hubris, Selling the Iraq War, premieres Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, here on MSNBC. John McCain lets the cat out of the bag on the real reason he's blocking Chuck Hagel. That's next. While John Boehner is working on his tan or his golf game or tea time or whatever, our congressional panel is here working tonight. Keep it right here. We're right back.